Hi there, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this Alchemi-Culture podcast episode. I am your host, Phoenix Aurelius. I am joined today by Matthew Wood. Probably many of you are familiar with Matthew Wood through his work of the earthwise herbals. I know that that was one of my first introductions to his work, although he's a very prolific author, if I can say so myself. He has many books. For those of you who aren't familiar with his work, basically after studying botany and astrology as preparatives, Matthew began to practice herbalism and homeopathy at Present Moment Herbs in Minneapolis in 1982. He currently is the author of 10 books on herbalism and related topics, including the book of Herbal Wisdom, the Earthwise Herbal and Earthwise Repertory, which we discussed just moments ago. And the most recent, 7 guideposts on the spiritual path, the Shamanism and Genesis, and also Holistic Medicine and the Extra Cellular Matrix, which is due out November 7th, I think, is when it's shipping from Amazon.
Yes, right.
So I've got my pre-order on that. I strongly suggest after listening to this interview, you go do the same. All of the links will be down in the description. He currently teaches through the Matthew Wood Institute of Herbalism, teaching your own brand, right, Matthew?
Yep, that's correct.
That's cool. Well, welcome to the show, brother. It's really a pleasure to have you on to chat with you.
Yeah, we really are brothers, I'd say. Yeah, it sounds like we're both alchemists. You're a practicing alchemist. I'm more of a temperamental alchemist or philosophical alchemist, I would call myself. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So yeah, we talked in advance here about starting with the Matrix, maybe just because it's the most recent book that just came out. I got these like 3 days ago. This is the advanced copies for the author. And it is not exactly innately an alchemical subject. I guess it could be. I mean, there probably is an alchemical interpretation, a way to fit this in. Maybe you can probably tell me when I finish describing it for the audience here. But the matrix is the area, well, basically between the capillary bed, the cell wall, and also the lymphatic capillary. So that's the inner space of the organism. That is the internalized mother ocean. 4.5 million years ago, the multicellular organs were developed out of single cells. The single cells somebody colonized the bottom of the ocean, became a little clone, all identical, and then they generated sea slime to protect themselves, and then they generated a compartment around themselves. Some cells moved to the outside to become the surface. That was an early differentiation of cells. And then we have a multicellular organism full of slime, which is the matrix polymers and fibers. So it turns out this is a regulatory system, and it's called the ground regulatory system. It was discovered or at least it was published in 1975 by Alfred Pissinger, one of my heroes, along with Paracelsus. Pissinger was a holistic MD at the University of Vienna in Vienna, at the medical school in Vienna. And it's interesting, when Rudolf Virchow came up with the cell theory in 1858, the University of Vienna Medical School under Karl von Rokitansky opposed the cell theory and said, no, this is wrong. This is like maybe intuitively wrong. It's just conceptually wrong. The cells are not the primal unit of life. The cells are controlled by their environment. And he put more emphasis on the capillary bed, and that still remains in German medicine to some extent. And that's why, for instance, ginkgo was developed as a drug because it's to increase peripheral circulation, and it's really kind of more of a drug in a way. It's on the border of herb and drug, but so that's the thinking behind that, and they value that at one point maybe still was the most prescribed drug in the world. But at any rate, they opposed the School of Vienna. They opposed this for generation after generation until finally Pissinger came along, and he proved that cell theory was wrong, and that the holistic and that the regulatory system is in the environment, the internal environment around the cells, and it is And that means that the basic premise of holism is scientific now, is proved. It's like reductionism. Yeah, it's fine. You can reduce everything all you want. But on a regulatory level, reductionism is completely overthrown. The smallest particles do not regulate what happens. They are regulated from above. And, they're not regulated by our brains or unless you're some yogi or something, or by our nervous system. There's several regulatory levels down. They are regulated by the ground regulatory system in the matrix. And I don't think I mentioned yet for our audience that there's a charge. Did I say there's a charge on the polymers? It sits there, and then some glucose comes in through the capillaries fairly simultaneously throughout the body. The glucose starts coming in from what we ate, for instance, and then there's a reaction, and the polymers everywhere react and send signals to the cells like, oh, more blood sugar coming in. Like, yeah, you can reproduce. We've been holding you back on that. We can grow some tissue, yeah, and generate some energy. Or maybe, yeah, there's some good quality protein coming along. Let's make some muscle. Let's make some collagen. And so this is the ground regulatory system, and it completely controls the cells. The cells they are not independent units of life. They are part of a collective ruled by this collective brain. The brain of the cells is not inside the brain. And as I said, we think of the nucleus. Oh, it's like the brain, but no, the nucleus is the reproductive organ, and the brain is outside. So it's like, again, a projection of human life on the cell. We get our brains and our genitals mixed up, and we project that onto the cells as well. So it's like, well, so that's kind of the overview. I should say, so the capillaries bring in the material. The cells there's white cells. There's various immune cells in the matrix that are floating around free. Then there's these tissues. There's actually a serous membrane, and so there may be some crossover. It's very interesting. They found that each organ has its own matrix compartment, which justifies the doctrine of organ specificity or organ independence, which we have in Paracelsus. We really have that pretty broad. I mean, even modern doctors, cardiologists, gastroenterologists, they kind of practice the same way. But we have the doctrine of organ specificity or organ affinity, where the herb has an affinity, where chelidonium, dandelion, they would be liver, gallbladder remedies,
right.
Or milk thistle, say. Yeah.
They work more on that hepatic system rather than focusing more broadly or non-specifically. They tend to be very localized. So, Matthew, one thing that comes up while I'm listening to all of this is that, well, first of all, let's go back to the very primordial ocean of single-celled organisms, okay? Because it seems like those single-celled eukaryotic bacteria, as they are attempting to survive in a wild and chaotic environment of this primordial ocean. And again, we don't even know that that's actually technically correct, but that's the best that we can conceive of with our theories and understanding at this moment.
Right.
So if that's the way that it happened, and they're trying to exist in this wildly erratic space, they form this slime, as you referred to it as. Would it be fair to refer to that as a type of biofilm, single-celled eukaryotic biofilm?
Yeah, I would say that. And in fact, there's quite a contiguous relationship between biofilms on our mucosa, or, now it's proved biofilms are floating in the bloodstream. I mean, there's just biofilms everywhere. And they signal and have a relationship back and forth across the cell membrane to the matrix, actually. And the matrix is a big slime, is a kind of a biofilm in its own. It's the inner biome, I guess you'd say. Yeah. So that is true.
So that's very interesting. So it seems like, as these single-celled organisms eventually evolve. You know, there's more different types of bacteria and eukaryotes, archaea, for instance, fungi, other things that start to exist. They form, you know, another type of biofilm. They would form, you know, what we would now refer to as a symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast and possibly archaea as well. So that's very interesting. But now what you're showing and what you're representing in your book is that multicellular life and tissues that are composed of multicellular life are also beginning to do a very similar thing. They're behaving in a similar way. Is that right? With their extracellular matrix as a type of biofilm, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, an interpreter, a protection and an interpreter of external material. Yeah, and Pissinger, the discoverer of this, he said, people say, well, how about the single cell floating in the ocean? That doesn't have a regulatory system. He said, well, that's seawater. Seawater is a regulatory system, and actually, to some extent, these critters probably they floated near almost certainly rocks on the edge of the ocean, sunlight beating down, muds and things like that. There was, you know, there was already an environment somewhat like a biofilm, but with seawater as a regulatory system, you and I know the importance of the cell salts and of Schussler's cell salts, and which, you know, really, what can you say, rubs elbows with the whole alchemical worldview.
Very much so, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, that's really interesting. You know, when people always talk to me about, well, how do you know that bacteria form inside of water and that's the way that life evolves? Well, within the alchemical corpus, we actually have what are known as the waterworks. So, you know, and you may be familiar with some of this, where we'll take rainwater and then typically let it to ferment just in an aerobic environment. So it just sits there for, you know, the longer you let it sit, the better. But then it just starts to form all of these colonies of what look like to our eye biofilm until you start to put it underneath the microscope. And then you can see there are dozens of different types of organisms that have actually evolved from this rainwater. And then what we do is we take that and we distill it out into elemental fractions first. So, you know, if we have 1 liter of water, the first 250 mils that come over is fire, the next is air, the next is water, the next is earth. And what you're left with in your flask is, and you have to be sure not to distill this to a dryness, is all of your eukaryotic life. You know, that could be bacteria, it could be fungi, it could be, you know, whatever was creating that biomass inside of the flask and causing the fermentation of water. And you know, then we have another series of distillations where we take those 12 or those 4 fractions of water and distill each of those into thirds, which give us all 12 signs of the zodiac. So like the first that comes over from fire would be the sulfur of fire, which we call cardinal fire in astrology, right? Aries. And then we would have fixed fire come over next, which would be we would have mutable come over next, which would be the Mercury of fire, and that would be Sagittarius. And then finally fixed fire would come over, and that would be your Leo fraction. And once you do that to all of your fractions, you have 12 different fractions, then you can add that microbial life from the first distillation that was retained in your flask. You can add that back to various combinations. Let's say you take, you know, cardinal fire, fixed water, mutable earth, add those together in equal portions and add that bacteria back. Well, now you start to get a very interesting evolution of life happening. And according to the different proportions of each of those fractions that you add back, you can actually evolve plant life, mineral life, animal life even. And each time that they live their life cycle, you can take that and calcine it, add it right back to that same fraction, and it gets more and more and more and more evolved to the point where, you know, at first you can see some plankton or something if you're working the vegetative path. And then over time, it starts to grow more like a moss. And then it will start to grow out of that moss more like what we would consider to be like a really small herbaceous plant. And you can keep doing this and doing this and doing this and keep seeing the evolution of life from nothing other than water to begin with. So for the alchemist mind, it's not that big of a stretch. I think for a lot of people who aren't familiar with that, though, that's like, how do you get from point A to point B?
Wow. Okay, I can sure see the connection to of the matrix to what you're talking about. Yes. So really, Kissinger was one genius that I chronicled and his work, and another was, you may be familiar with Gerald Pollack.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, up there where Saja lives. So Gerald worked on, the hydrophilic. So water on a hydrophilic surface, the sun beats on it, and it creates a different type of water, actually, and structured water. And so this is the alchemical dew, of course, the dew collected off of
Yeah.
plants, and one could make it more efficiently off of rainwater off the roof or something. But so yes, we have a different kind of water, and this is the water that life always needs and thrives in. So yeah, I can see why you're starting with rainwater there.
Well, yeah, and it's very interesting because dew water has very similar properties. It's just harder to get a hold of,
Right, right.
especially to get it without having any sort of determination. You talked about the hydrophilic layer, especially on plants and grasses and, things
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
what's it called? Alchemilla vulgaris, for lady's mantle.
yeah.
It has a specific affinity for holding on to this through little hydrophilic tentacular hairs that it has. So, but then it's essentially determined to the vegetable kingdom, where collecting dew in just glass so that it doesn't have any sort of affinity to it is much harder than rain, where you can just set a big glass carboy
Yeah.
out in the rain with a big funnel or something. So
Yeah.
yeah, so this is really interesting to me though, Matthew, because this extracellular matrix, let's go back to the part where you said that it does have an electrical charge.
Yeah.
Now, that means that it has to be interacting, of course, with electromagnetism and electrochemistry, meaning that it is in some way interfacing with both the nervous system as well as the endocrine systems of the body.
Yeah.
This is very interesting because, this ties in so many different aspects of the body and its electromagnetic components, which are today really not very well understood. So some of what you're talking about and suggesting is that all the cells in the body, in one way or another, are at least interfacing with electromagnetism, which is, in my opinion, something that really needs to be looked at, because that would indicate that individual organs, individual systems are alive, not just from the cellular level, of course, but that their lowest common denominator with all of the rest of creation is that they're electromagnetically alive. They're given this kind of spirit, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. It's interesting. So in the book, so really there's only one book in two different translations available for studying the matrix. That's Kissinger and his co-worker Harmet Heine. And one is published by North Atlantic Books, the other one by Haag Publishing in Stuttgart or Germany somewhere. And they're kind of slightly different, but the same book. I bought both of them. And so there were no other books on the matrix. There's some very good papers, but there were no other books. So I wrote this book in order for to communicate this to the holistic world. I can't remember why did I get off on this. I might as well go on, just some history of the book, because nobody really, this was not known information to the holistic world either. Here was this incredible finding, and even the holistic people didn't know about it. One of the scientists I quoted, she says, the problem with the matrix is it's very difficult to visualize. That is a big problem, and otherwise then you have trying to work with non-linear thinking too. You're having to think holistically about it too. So it's very hard to visualize. And I know what I was going to talk about. Yes, and so Kissinger and Heine, they talk about meeting with some anthroposophical doctors, and they kind of jointly concluded, the bunch of them, that the matrix charge, that this charge on the polymers was essentially equivalent to the vital force, or the etheric body.
Yeah.
Because as Steiner would talk about it. So yeah, so now whether that's true or not, it is a electrical electrical magnetic force, and and it shows the possible sensitivity to life on that level, a tremendous sensitivity, which would explain astrology, etc. And of course, this whole electromagnetic field has been ignored. Do you know he's down in your area, Arthur Furstenberg, in the book The Invisible Rainbow: The History of Humanity and Electricity?
Yeah, in
Yeah,
fact, I've got that book upstairs. I've been reading a lot about that over the last few months.
yeah, he's an amazing character, and he and so I mean that just proves electromagnetic frequencies are completely are real, and for better and for worse, and both the ones
Yeah,
coming from both ones coming from outer space, creating these four elements, etc., of water, and the ones made by humanity, etc.
yeah,
So, and it makes sense that the matrix would be extremely sensitive to that. I would have to guess, just because now we think of, oh well, here's the edge of our body. How is the electromagnetic frequency going to get into that? Well, you look at, you hold your hand up to the sun or a light bulb, and the light shines through. I mean, that is getting through. That electromagnetic energy is getting through us all the time.
yeah,
And therefore there is a sensitivity, and that's actually what's renewing that special water that Gerald Pollack discovered, the H3O/H2O2, and the semi-crystalline water of the internal of organic life forms. So it's constantly being renewed by the sun, and also it's sensitized in all the time by by these electromagnetic frequencies, which include the astrological. And I used to just believe in the principle of as above so below, and like treats
yeah,
like, in some sort of philosophical sense only, but now I'm forced to believe in the actual little rays sent out by the planets and be
yeah.
picked up by us. So
Well,
yeah.
that's a really cool and important kind of discussion too, because you and I were chatting before we actually started recording about ancestrale, or the one of the primary entia of disease of Paracelsus, saying that the cause of disease of the stars is a main thing.
Yeah.
He even went so far as to actually coin the term astral body, and
Yeah.
to talk about he was the first person in history that we have in the West to actually talk about those ideas, even though they were made manifest in other ways, I guess, in India long before he had talked about them. In the West, it was a completely novel idea. And in this regard, I'm always explaining to people, listen, various proximities of other planets to our planet are going to put various different types of stresses. Okay, so if we do agree, not everybody agrees these days. Okay, the world is rapidly changing in its information and who buys into what narratives, but
Yeah.
as modern science currently stands, there are four major forces that are physical forces that at least we were taught in school. So you have strong nuclear, weak nuclear, electromagnetic, and gravitational force.
Mm.
These, if Jupiter ends up coming relatively close to Earth in its orbit, then
Yeah.
we have magnetospheric, we have electromagnetic, and we also have gravitational forces, stresses put on our planet that are going to displace our gravitational attraction, our electromagnetic field of the planet. And as that happens, sunlight in certain areas where that displacement is the least is going to penetrate deeper. Where it's the most, it won't penetrate nearly as much. And so we can see that just on a purely physiological level here, how solar forces based on other astronomical bodies can actually influence us from an electromagnetic perspective, because we are dependent as life forms on this planet. We are dependent upon a consistent impulse of the Earth's electromagnetism, and in order for all of the electromagnetic components like our nervous system, endocrine system, extracellular matrix, et cetera, anything that has electrical resistance is going to end up reacting to that. Even our computers do, for Christ's sake,
Yes.
So, I think that it's really interesting where this is tying over, because within the next, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, as more of this information that's in your book gets out and people start thinking about the ramifications of it, we might
Yeah.
have more information and more basis to go on rather than just throwing the astrological baby out with the bathwater, right?
Yeah, yes. I wrote this book for the alternative, holistic, more the medical community. I'm seeing immediately the alchemical community fits in even more, perhaps. And I wrote it so that we would feel that yes, that holistic medicine is scientifically justified. Now, not that we have to have that, but it is nice.
Yeah.
And one woman who interviewed me, she said I was crying when I was reading it because it just meant so much to her to be justified that way. Now, I was kind of a 10th generation heretic. I didn't really care that much about being justified. I feel like my family, I was raised Quaker. My family were like non-muggles out in some other dimension that
Exactly.
we're still trying to, it's like yeah, we don't totally get it all the time. And but so I don't feel that need to prove it so much, but I like doing that. And I felt, and the thing is, it's important to know about the matrix and how it works and so on. And so first, who's going to pick up on this first? I think it's going to be the alternative community, because the regular scientific community has pretty much, like, they've named all 357 different particles that they can find that are normally found in the human matrix, etc. All that's been figured out, but they don't consider it as a whole functioning together to any great extent. There are some of them that do get it, but not very many, and they don't publish papers. There just are not papers. There's nothing but those two books, or one book split into two, kind of a Geminian situation. It even has two authors, but Kissinger and Heine.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so I wrote this for us, for the alternative holistic community, and I'm hoping in 10, 15 years that someone plagiarizes it or redoes it. I mean, because I did all the work I'm very good at putting things in an understandable form as a writer. And I tried to make this I tried to get over what that scientist rightly said, hard to visualize. I tried to visualize it for the reader. And so it's going to take maybe a year or two for a person to really kind of internalize it. And you know how that is. I mean, you didn't grow up and they didn't teach you alchemy in second grade or something, so you had to
Exactly.
learn it. And the same here, and we'll internalize it and we'll start using it in our conversations, and then they're going to have to catch up. Those scientists, we can look at them and say, oh, you don't know about the matrix and the holistic regulation of the body. So yeah, so that's my ulterior motive, but it is so important too. And one thing, it helped teach me, just to be a little herbal about it, the importance of mucilages, which
Yeah.
contain polysaccharides, which are the same thing as these polymers, which are glucosaminoglycans is their technical name. So of course we don't use that, but so the slime from plants is a good source, and sometimes we need to coat and soothe our membranes with that. And that and it turns out the mortar between the cells, the cement between the cells lining the small intestine, is is made up of these of polymers of the GAGs, the glucosaminoglycans, or the polysaccharides. And so we need to sometimes tuck point. We need to do a little bit of cement work there on the cell wall. And actually, it was early proved as early as the late 90s that glucosamine sulfate, which is just a slurry of animal origin gags here, that it can penetrate through these gaps between the cells, because it is because it's the same material. So also, so this stuff can get into the matrix and have an effect, or into joints, etc. Yeah.
And that is actually really interesting, Matthew, because for what I'm hearing here is that polysaccharide rich herbs. So let's talk about reishi, for instance, is a reishi decoction. You have tons of polysaccharides in most of
Yeah.
our polypores.
Yeah.
this can actually be used in somewhat bioidentical ways, is what I'm hearing,
Yeah.
to fill in gaps in extracellular matrix fluid. Is that true?
Yeah, well, that would be one thing that, well, although actually, it sometimes, the matrix tells cells to migrate to that spot. There's like a bald spot. We need some cells there. Sometimes maybe, like you're saying, yes, we need some more, or we need to thicken or densify the polysaccharides in the matrix there. And sometimes it needs to be in the cracks between the cells. And sometimes perhaps we're also, of course, some of these are probiotics, but actually with something like reishi, so this is kind of interesting. I hadn't thought this way until you brought it up. That's why these conversations are so great. Like I kind of thought of, marshmallow or okra kind of as not very intelligent, just a mucilage that, you slap on your whitewash on the wall or something. But something like reishi, we really have a profound intelligence in that, in those polysaccharides. And so we could really be rebuilding the matrix, not just to be with something like that. I'm inclined to think not just to be able to run the organism really well, but maybe to be more open to spiritual or soul or, or vital or cosmic signaling or signals, because this is the sensitivity again to EMFs, and this is the regulatory system. So that's really bing.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and you were talking about in the extracellular matrix, and correct me if I'm wrong. I'll have to read the book and really digest it as soon as it comes out in order to really get a full comprehension. I'm just going off of what I've heard and what I think I'm picking up on, is that there are certain white blood cells inside of that extracellular matrix as well, right? Which means in part lymphocytes. And so reishi, for instance, as an immune adaptogen, can help with that as well. It's just interesting because all of these kind of subcomponents in the reductionist model that we've looked at are starting to, in so many ways, be reconfigured, and we're realizing that there are other ways of explaining the same type of actions that the reductionist model says, oh, this herb has this because of this. They postulate it this way. But if we look at it from slightly different stance, we can see that perennially it appears to be true regardless of what stance you have, whether you know about the extracellular matrix, or whether we go back 3,000 years into prehistory and we find that people are taking chaga and reishi anyway because it benefits their wellness. It's just interesting to see things that are perennially healthy for us are they will always be here and they'll stand the test of time. Largely those are, for the human component, herbal materials, herbal and animal allies as medicines. This is actually a perfect time for us to take just a short break. We'll go ahead, and when we come back, let's talk a little bit more about some herbalism and astroherbalism, just see where the conversation takes us.
Are you looking for the highest quality herbal supplements and remedies for your home apothecary? Or maybe you're looking to take your spellcraft, magical workings, or offerings to the next level. Whatever your reasons might be, we have hundreds of herbal spagyric items available, and every purchase supports our work and helps bring spagyria into the light of the modern world. Here at the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy, we produce dozens and dozens of items of spagyric pharmacopoeia each year, even though we only need a few samples for our research purposes. So the remaining quantities are available to the public in our online spagyric apothecary. Only the highest quality natural, organic, biodynamic, and ethically wildcrafted materials go into our products, and every purchase you make helps fund our research. As an Alchemi-Culture podcast listener, you can get your hands on our professionally crafted small batch spagyric products for 15% off using coupon code LISTEN15. So go ahead and browse our enormous selection of products and get yourself something new, or pick up one of your favorite products today. Visit phoenixaurelius.org/apothecary and enter coupon code LISTEN15 to take 15% off your entire order. And thanks in advance for supporting our research.
While we were on the break, Matthew and I were talking about Earthwise Herbal, and I said, one thing I really want to chat about, because these are probably your best-selling books, is where did you get the inspiration to write Earthwise Herbals. And for those of you who haven't read them, they are spectacular. You have one on more modern herbs, and then you also have an Earthwise on more ancestral and ancient herbs. How did you get the idea to write both compendiums, and which one? I'm not familiar. I should probably know this, but which one did you write first?
Well, I can't remember now, although the copyright would tell us, but
Fair enough. I'll research that while you tell us a little bit more about the inspiration then.
yeah, but if I had to bet, it would be the North American, the more recent, because there's the herbs I use the most and really love. And kind of grew up using from my late 20s on in the herb store. Yeah, so this is astrological. When I was 20, I still was a little bit of a skeptic about astrology, and one of my one of my high school friends was reading my horoscope, and she said, you will never be satisfied until you've written a book. And I immediately knew it was totally true. She said, Mars and Capricorn in the third house. And it was like at that moment, astrology was proved for me. And I knew that was true. I knew that, and that book was the Book of Herbal Wisdom, which I had to write to show kind of the consciousness of herbs, the best to the extent I could. I wasn't trying to do the consciousness of hallucinogens, but just herbs. They have a personality, and that personality shines through the law of correspondence or the doctrine of signatures down to the physical uses and the external signatures. And so that was the book that I had to write. And it was another astrologer. It was Judith Hill. Actually, I was visiting her, and she said, "You're so relaxed. Like, have you completed your life mission?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess I have. Yeah." When I finished that book, it's like, oh, now I can do whatever I want. But my life has just consisted in expanding on that book. But again, it was an astrologer, I mean, who could pick up on that. She said, "Yeah, you kind of lead the life of Riley. Like you're not driven. Even your internal spiritual drive you're kind of mellow about that as well as external." And it was so true. And so I if astrology wasn't true, still the astrologers are the people who really pick up on character and destiny and fate and your fulfillment of your profoundest needs and everything. Of course, we know that astrology is for real, but it they are just experts at reading that level. So I have to give credit there, and it was so insightful. And I know since that time, that was 5 or 6 years ago, that she's pretty much felt like she's reached where she has fulfilled her destiny too, and is more relaxed about that. Because it was kind of eating. I shouldn't talk about somebody maybe, but it's not a bad thing. It's just she's more relaxed. She's gotten her story out that she needs to do.
Well, which is so important. I mean, she's a torchbearer of a tradition that could possibly have died out if not for her. If you take a look at modern 21st century sources and teachers of this, especially medical astrology tradition, she's it.
Yep. Yeah. And that, of course, is a deep, important part of our tradition. Paracelsus did astrological medicine. They say Hippocrates and those guys did, but I'm not sure that they did it quite the way we do. But medical astrology is a crucial part. And although, as I mentioned, and when we were talking ahead of time, I don't do a lot of charts with my work with clients with herbs. I do occasionally. I still use a reference system. I'm still thinking, well, the whole organ specificity that an organ has its own kind of intelligence, that fits the astrological model, and in different ways. And then I think of the menses. Oh, they're so Libra and they're billowy, beautiful flowers. And when I'm looking, and certainly you can tell scorpionic plants. They kind of look like a snake or a scorpion or something, and look toxic, or they're purple or orange and black or something. And so you which reminds me of my neighbor. So I had some funny neighbors, just aside here. Sam, he was 6'7", he's like 300 pounds, and he said, I want to plant black lilies in the yard, and I want to plant orange lilies and black irises too. Paracelsus himself would be attracted into incarnation right there, and Nietzsche and Schopenhauer too. But I suppose it would scare the little bunny rabbits.
He sounds like you got a pretty colorful neighbor going on here.
Yeah, yeah, that definitely, right. Yeah. But at any rate, so astrological thinking has been very important to me, even though I don't always state that in the books I write. But so the Book of Herbal Wisdom, and then with the Earthwise Herbal, I just felt like, my model was homeopathy, these really well-detailed materia medicas. But the difference between homeopathy and herbalism is, well, they look for the personality too, but they don't see it like, they don't use the doctrine of signatures. They don't see it so thoroughly. I found, and actually by the time I was finishing, I think it was the first of those two volumes. By the time I was finishing it, it was like I could just read the kind of what an herb was for, how it all fit together. And that was not so much from the signatures help. And that did give me my initial insights there. But like, if something has a mucilage, astringent, volatile oils, it's like I could just predict what it was going to do,
Yeah.
and that really got me to a level where I felt like this is going to be a very good book that really does tell us what. So I could write about something. I remember it was acacia. I've never used acacia, but here's the ingredients. Oh, well, I can understand why that does what it does, and then you can write a good account. Actually, Dioscorides, Greek. Roman, he's like that. He just knows it so well. He was buying drugs and using them for the Roman armies. So but at any rate, so those are very good books. And then finally, I wanted a repertory mimicking homeopathy again. And the truth is that the repertory was constructed independently of the symptomology, the symptoms collected in the materia medica, in the earthwise herbal, because it just was too much work to go back and try and extract all that, at least to
Yeah.
me. And also, I wanted to, homeopathy values clinical symptoms, and I wanted to take symptoms that were more clinical, not that they all are, or just very characteristic in the herbal tradition. And the earthwise herbal has really proved itself. I have a friend, my co-author on that, David Ryan. He and I were working on a computer program for this because the homeopaths like
Oh,
that.
that'd be great.
Yeah, Zeus, Zeus software, Germany or Italy or somewhere. They are going to publish it, but then he and I are going to work on trying to integrate it more with the earthwise herbals and work with the symptoms and just get that even more. And he's indefatigable. So it's a lot of work. Well, I've moved on to other things. So yeah.
By the way, you did
Yeah.
publish the Earthwise Herbal of the Old World herbs first. That came out in 2008, and then New World was the year following in 2009.
Well, I lost my bet.
Yeah, exactly. You lost your own bet. You're the author, man. Not great to lose your own bet there. But regardless of that, the books are absolutely amazing. I'm sitting here with the Earthwise Herbal Repertory right here, and this is a really fun book. I was flipping through it the other day. I had a friend over who was suffering with hemorrhoids, and I said, well, you know what, we should actually just flip through this to see what it says. And the first thing that came up was horse chestnut, which was really cool because here in the Spagyric lab, we do have some horse chestnut, but in its full potency form, you wouldn't want to take it. It needs to be homeopathically suffused.
Okay.
And otherwise, it's probably has greater toxin quality than than what you might want. So yeah, it was very cool. And then, there was a list of about 12 other herbs that we have and different ways of applying it. Do you apply it topically? And then also what it's used for in terms of, its action and how it might help with that particular condition. And so, it was really fun actually just being able to go through that and be like, oh yeah, we've got half these herbs in stock. Let's go ahead and just whip something up for you. Witch hazel, of course, came up in there, and a few other things. So yeah, I think that it's an excellent addition to any herbalist library, or even a home, an aspiring herbalist. You know, I call them sometimes mom herbalists or parent herbalists, where, you know, you got kids and you need to have a quick reference guide to know what to do and what you can call up and cook up here at home to help take care of the issues that arise.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's some effort at differential diagnosis or differential evaluation that one, say bleeding hemorrhoids, that would be
Right.
yeah, I think Biden's itching hemorrhoids, more in the rhubarb family, that I learned from personal experience. We got a plant called R Smart for a very good reason.
Wow. Now that's an appropriately named herb, huh?
Yeah, one of the knotweeds, and so the knotweeds in general are good there for the itchiness, and then you have a pain sharp. I don't know if I put that in there, mullein, and that came from a scientific source. So I wasn't quite as sure about it. I liked the empirical herbal tradition. So
Yeah, I think even St. John's wort had made its way in for that particular listing, and of course that would help with kind of topical numbing a little bit, analgesic kind of effect.
And I would say, no, I'm not sure I said it then, but very sensitivity, nerve sensitivity, people that are just usually sensitive, and you could not be sensitive elsewhere, but sensitive there. So
yeah. Absolutely, yeah, especially with a condition like that, it could be especially sensitive even if you're not sensitive elsewhere. So yeah, anyway, that was just a great example that I actually had of pulling this off the shelf, and this was maybe a week ago at best. So I thought that was kind of cool. So with that being said, you're still using herbs. You're clinically seeing, clients and things like that regularly. Is that true?
Well, yeah, only about 10 people a week or so. I'm a month rather, because I teach so much and I don't try to advertise myself. I'm not really that interested. And people call me and I say, or contact me more likely by email, and it's like, well, I try to find them if there's a good herbalist in their area, then that's good. But so I'm not, pursuing that as I once did. It's exhaustive. When you're seeing clients, your back is to the wall, sort of Damocles over your head in a way. It's like you got to get results, and gee, I mean, and they don't always get back to you. I remember one time, so I go to help somebody at their house. Oh yeah, you helped my son 10 years ago. He had pneumonia. We're about to go to the hospital. He's in Madison, Wisconsin. You helped him over the telephone. Suggested mullein, totally took care of the problem. It's like, oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah, I never heard back. Thanks for that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, isn't that funny how it's so dire for the communication to happen on a one-sided angle when there's a major problem, but not necessarily to let you know that it cleared up.
Yeah, right. And I do appreciate people that get back with that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, me too. It helps the case studies and helps me understand what I should be looking at or not be looking at or avoid or incorporate in future cases. So yeah, it's critical. So yeah, these days you mostly find yourself teaching herbalism. Of course, you run your own institute, Matthew Wood Institute of Herbalism. You've got a number of different free offerings on that website. And then you also teach some pretty high level courses as well.
Yeah. Well, I am co-teaching with Judith Hill right now through the each sign of the zodiac and herbs for each sign or for the conditions. She discovered she has what she calls syndromes for each sign, which is just kind of the dominant patterns, which often have to do with the signs, the signs that are quincunx, the sign that's behind, the sign that's opposite. They will have a kind of, oftentimes their problems, or they generate problems. Well, Aquarius, for instance, has poor circulation in the extremities, we find, often pale. And, so there's Leo, the opposite there. So, and it has rigidity like Capricorn as well, too. So she has the syndromes there, and I try to provide the the herbs for these different organs, and or signs, etc., or planets. I do find I always love to link the signs and the herbs but I find that the signs and that the planets and the herbs actually more naturally do correspond. And this is one of those discoveries where this is not what I wanted. I wanted to go by the sign and not by the planet.
Yeah.
I found that to be the case. So for what that's worth, do you make are your spagyric preparations made according to astrological events and things?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I don't have a physical copy of it right out front, but I'm actually posting a 2022 calendar. So kind of like before the episode started, we had kind of talked about, medical astrology and how I started off with Judith Hill, but kind of changed the calculations that I was using. What I did at one time was I took on probably close to 30 clients as research clients. This was back in 2014 and 2015. And what I would do is I would cast natal comparative charts every day of every single month for 13 entire months. So they were signed on for a 13-month thing. That way I could see them throughout an entire lunar year and chart their cycles and gather a lot of data. And I would produce these charts both in tropical Western and then at that time in Vedic astrology, and be able to see if I could predict for the entire month ahead days where their pre-existing conditions might be particularly problematic, or see if, based on their natal chart, if there were any patterns that I could see in that chart that would lend themselves to needing to be remedied in one way or the other to alleviate some of those kind of symptomatic complaints that they had. Most of them had pre-existing conditions. So that's what I did. And what I found was that it was decent. It was maybe like a 50 to 60% accuracy with the tropical astrology, with the predictions. And then what I would do after I cast all these was that I would make 8 custom spagyric formulations for that individual for that month. And it could be as simple as a single herb, but usually there were multi-herb spagyric formulations that were given to them, one for each day of the week, Monday through Sunday, and then one that they took every single day of the week on top of their daily. And we had a really good success with that. We were able to see people that had, schizophrenia and depression issues, manic bipolarity, lots of different psychoaffective disorders were completely ameliorated and in several cases eliminated. But what I ended up seeing about halfway through was that the tropical astrology charts that we were using didn't have the amount of accuracy to them in the predictions that I would be able to formulate properly. Whereas there is close to about an 80% viability in the predictions based on the Vedic. So I thought, well, hell, let's go with that. And I went with that. And then, I started getting into the International Astronomical Union stuff and comparing what they're showing around the ecliptic to the Vedic chart. And it basically almost caused me an aneurysm, Matthew, because I was like, it's so different. Like where the planets actually are and where we're saying that they are different. And so I tried to create all sorts of new charts and tried to work out the mathematics, and it was very hard for me. And it wasn't until a couple of years later I ran into this guy named Athens Chimenti, brilliant astrologer, by the way, absolutely brilliant. He runs this company called masteringthezodiac.com. And he just found this one particular software called the Capricorn, what's it called? Prometheus Capricorn software, where they offered in there the opportunity to do the 13 zodiac ecliptics, but actually measure each constellation for its actual size. So, as you know, traditional astrology, we say that there's 12 constellations, each of 30 degrees, right? And that makes up our ecliptic. Well, when we look at it astronomically, it's not that simple. Like, for instance, Virgo is really huge and Pisces is really huge, whereas Libra is this little tiny little thing in the sky, along the ecliptic.
Yeah.
And so he did some calculations, some measurements, and was able to still keep a 360-degree circular chart, but was able to show the comparative relationship of the size of each of the constellations the way that they would actually show up. And I thought, that's interesting. So I went back to a couple of my clients. I said, hey, I'm doing some more research. It would be free. You don't have to pay for it. I just want to see if I can make up any of the discrepancies in that extra 20% of error that I had with my predictions if I were to use this form of astrology. They said, sure, go ahead, do whatever you want. So I did. I went back and I recast all the charts. And then at this point, I already had the data of what they were suffering with at those times and the predictions I had made. So what I did was I just compared this new astrology form, cast the chart, made the predictions as if I normally would, and then compared it to the symptoms they actually had. It was now at about a 97% accuracy rate. And so I went back and I started studying again on a couple more people, maybe another 15 clients over a 13-month period, and gathered all of that data. And again, that was about 95 to 97% correct. The things where I couldn't predict what was going on were mostly like arthritis symptoms. And we were able to find that at least 1 to 3% of the difference that I wasn't able to predict had something to do with barometry and barometric pressure. So higher the barometric pressure, the more the pain. You talk to just about any of the old people and they can tell you when a storm's coming because they can feel it in their bones or they start to get tired or whatever. So we were able to account for that discrepancy. And then fast forward a couple of years, I started working with intrinsic data field technology and analyzing, when I see my clients, I find out which of the 5 entia are affecting them first as kind of a macro causation. Because it does no good to apply just an herbal remedy that isn't astronomically made if their cause of disease is ens astrale. Just as well, if it's an ens spirituale issue, there's no sense throwing an herb at it at all. You have to get rid of the spirit that is causing the issue or the electromagnetism or whatever. So anytime they'd have ens astrale, I would puzzle for years. It took about 3 years of me trying, this and that and everything else to try and figure out, how do I eliminate their ens astrale issue? And what I found out, it's not true with every one of the planets, but most of the main planets, especially our main afflictors of Mars and Saturn, when they are in the birth chart, here's your ideal astral template, is the birth chart. This person will experience a disease corresponding to Saturn or Mars when at any given point in time, it's at a semi-sextile or a square to their natal position. So this was something that, I had never heard of before, where you take, obviously we try and understand like, okay, the disease happens, it's present in their natal chart, this thing, and then we'll try and perform an astrological judgment of the time when something happened and try and draw causation. But I was actually able to chart time over time over time, different for every different planet, of course, how disease would happen based on their actual natal chart and the comparative chart of any given day or any given point in time, and started to see that there were definitive relationships there. So now the way that I work with herbs and astrology in my practice, it started with a very conventional way, like our buddy Seja, for instance, almost identical. That's the way I started off doing things, was very much so based on the Renaissance thing. But when you go back to Paracelsus, he hated the astrology of the time. He hated the tropical chart. He used astrology, but he did it in a completely different way. He even told the astrologers of the time that he was going to cast their phlebotomy tables and their astrology into the Sea of Pilatus. He was very cantankerous about it. So when I started looking more into that and approaching it from that angle, I started to see that there were ways where I could definitively eliminate that ens astrale, but I couldn't do it using tropical Western or Vedic or even tropical or even modern Western sidereal through a 12 sign system or an equal house system where it's, all 30 degrees each for each constellation. The only way that I was actually able to do this, well, there's 2 ways. One is to take the actual declination and the astronomical coordinates of the planets in their natal chart and cast a talisman with that energy and give it to them, or to be able to take this particular form of astrology's coordinates So, it might be like 43 degrees Virgo, for instance. And most astrologers say, well, there's only 30 degrees Virgo. And it's like, well, if you take into account how big Virgo is, that's not true. There's only a few degrees of Ophiuchus, for instance. There's only a few degrees of Libra, but there's like 45 degrees almost of Virgo, and Pisces is almost the same in the sky as well. So, I started to use that system, and it covered all of the discrepancies, and it started to take care of the ancestrally of my clients. So telling this to most astrologers, though, is, if they're not open-minded, they just kind of get mad at me. And,
Yeah, I can imagine.
yeah, and even in Judith Hill's book, which I owe her so much, because, if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't have got into medical astrology in the first place, actually. Or I would have been interested in it, but had no guideposts.
Yeah, right.
So, but in the beginning of her book, she makes a strong argument that is maybe not so scientifically sound about the relationship of Aries starting on spring equinox, and talking about that being an astronomical observance. And she makes a strong case that tropical astrology is the only thing that really works for this system. And my experience is I take the exact same things that she teaches about the signs and the degrees and the afflictions, and I just apply it to the different calculations and put it to scrutiny in a clinical environment where I was split testing this versus this versus this. And I've come to slightly different conclusions. So I would love to talk with her one of these days about all of those things, but at the same time, it's a delicate issue for me, because I don't ever want to go to somebody that I owe so much to and say, I'm seeing that, it's not exactly wrong. It's just there might be a different system. Do you have any other way of explaining my results, or, things like that? But it's a delicate thing with most astrologers. I've been cast under the bus and just called a complete nutter on multiple occasions. And of course, it doesn't help that I wear, Viking clothes and wizard hats and whatever else. It doesn't necessarily help with the credibility all the time, but.
Well, astrologers are, Uranus's children, and that they shouldn't care about that. Yeah. I know from talking to Judith, she places a great for her. The grand man of the zodiac, that these signs are regions, really, for her, which I had a very hard time adapting to, because no herb that I know, virtually no herb, treats a region. They just don't have affinities that way. But she can, pull a tremendous reading out of using the regions that way. So she even uses it differently than I would think about it. And I've had to go with my tail between my legs on some of my ideas, which make sense herbally or medically, but don't fit that system. And talking about regions, that does fit the Greek model. Are you familiar with Robert Schmidt's work at all? The Greek astrology, or it would come down. It's more famous through Chris Barron's book, but Robert did all the original research. And there's a Robert H. Schmidt astrology.com website or something like that. Look it up.
That out. Yeah.
Yeah. No, he translated all the original Greek texts, and nobody else has touched, most of these texts. He was a tremendous translator. I mean, he was a Greek scholar and knew philosophy, knew the whole background, Plato, Aristotle. They actually his wife still alive. Sadly, he died, but they've traced the author. They believe that they can prove that it was Eudoxus, the mathematician, who lived kind of partway between Plato and Aristotle. And he was a physician. And I even suggested to Ellen, his wife, that astrology evolved perhaps as a medical system, very predominantly. Robert said, well, it evolved at least as a cosmological system. We can't tell if in the first generation they were actually using it for divination and stuff like that. But getting back to the original Greek texts, you do find a lot of stuff that's changed over the centuries. And you do see how the Greek astrology becomes, on the one hand, Ayurvedic, and on the other hand, Western astrology. The Ayurvedic here's again another one where you'll get criticized by the Ayurvedic. Oh, we have star charts that are 5,000 years old. Yeah,
Exactly.
well,
Yeah.
those come from Babylonia. It was the Babylonians who observed the stars. You can't find anything like that in India. People observing the stars for 2,000-3,000 years before they figured out, well, 2,000 years before they figured out how to predict where the planets would be. So those charts came into India from Greece, but originally from Babylon. Well, at any rate, this is the ancestral astrology there, and of course, drawing on Mesopotamian and Egyptian sources, but Eudoxus seems to have put it all together, and he was called the last of the Pythagoreans for a reason, in that he included their worldview, that they were working towards this view of the cosmos as a living animal, quote unquote, or as a living being that they could predict. Animal to them meant something different, because they didn't.
Yeah.
They didn't have
like soul, the way we would talk about the soul today.
Yeah, it meant that anything that moved, animals and souls move. And also, they didn't have a word that differentiated humans from animals until about a generation before Socrates. That humans were animals that talk versus animals that don't. So very different. And I mean, I'm a shamanist. Well, that's my other book. We'll have to get onto that. But and so I have a high value for animals, certainly. But at any rate, so there's some interesting materials there. In fact, one thing I want to talk about, one thing I learned about from him was the difference between modern speech and ancient speech, or oftentimes it's indigenous speech and Western cultural speech. And so in ancient times, there was a type of speech, he calls it phosis, and a few of the scholars would use that word too. But phosis means just to describe something, period. No value judgment. The car went down the street and then the muffler fell off, and then so it's just descriptive, explanatory, and then how do you expand upon that? They did not use the syllogism. They did not use the if-then method, which is the basis of science, really, as we'll see in a moment. So if-then is a premise, and then a test, and then a conclusion. And that's the way science is based on. And that did not exist until Plato. Aristotle says that Plato was the first who used logos, for extracting information by setting up syllogisms. So the famous one is, if Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, then Socrates is mortal. Right. And that's a syllogism. Okay, so the way that the ancient, the previous to that, we'd have people like Heraclitus, the two individuals, strangely, who use phosic speech ruthlessly and consciously are Heraclitus, the dark, and Jesus, actually. And so the two of them speak Heraclitus would say, the road up also goes down, is also the road down, which is, that's like stretching your mind, as Robert would say. Like, you're talking about a road, you make an observation, it is true, it goes up, it has to go down if you're going the other way. And so, but it has a meaning, like, well, that could be like life, like I reach my peak and then I go down, or like my reputation, or the empire, or the king, or the economy, or whatever. And so there's so much like that. He also says the river, you can't step in the same river twice.
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true, because it's constantly flowing. It's constantly changing.
Yes. And so that's stretching. That's an observation that yet carries you a little further. Okay, so this is the ancient way of thinking and speaking, and they did not reach a conclusion. You could also, the same river. Yeah, well, of course, I don't care. You could ignore that. It could not light your light bulb, maybe. So there's a voluntary, this type of speech and expansion of speech does not demand that you agree or disagree or even notice it. It's your free will. And so versus the syllogism, you are forced to agree. Well, yeah, I have to agree. Socrates is mortal, because A, B, C, it's all lined up.
Yeah, it's
And
more like a mathematical, like a geometric proof in a certain regard.
the proof, yeah. And now the danger of this is, see, okay, a whole bunch of people want to agree with that, and a whole bunch of people might not. I mean, they have some other premise. Well, yeah, but I don't believe in mortality or something, or like. Not all people are immortal. I don't know. There might be people that have a different experience, but that's a hard syllogism to argue against. But at any rate, all of a sudden, you either agree or you disagree. So you have a polarization. You have two parties. You have a right and a wrong, and this characterizes Western civilization and society, and people going around all the time telling everybody what is right and what is wrong. I get so sick of this, and um, and I grew up on a little Indian reservation in the middle of nowhere. I just spent my first 2 years there, Florida Everglades. And my dad said, yeah, that they'd say white people coming around preaching at them all the time. They'd say, too much Jesus. That's what I as that. That's what white people are like so often. We know, we have truths. We know what's right. Well, this is really just an aberration of speech. This is how they've been taught to speak and to think and get stuck in this. And so instead but phasis, you learn by, so inference, it's inferred, or similarity or contrast. So in Jesus's stuff, there's an Aramaicism, the kingdom of heaven is like blah, blah, blah. In Aramaic, it's actually, it is the case with X the way it is with Y. And so that's a language that was set up where they had a mechanism set up, not the syllogism, but for using Fossic thought and speech. This is interesting because our languages became infected then with syllogism, where almost all the European languages. Well, okay, so at the same time, so Plato did not favor one over the other. He used both. And you're probably familiar with his use of archetypes and everything.
Absolutely.
And he really puts that on the map because the shamanism and the seven guideposts, shamanic story in Genesis. I find Genesis is written by inference. Yes, it's written with inferences and contrasts and word plays, but it's not really that much archetypal knowledge in a way. Plato put that on the map. Plato was grappling with a way to make phasis more speakable, to give it more access into the world. And so he came up with, we don't really even have a name for it, but archetypal language. So he came up with the idea, the primal archetype essence from which everything, so that's the signature, the personality, the mental state, the physical, the appearance, the constitution, all stem from that primal idea, eidos, he said, and he worked out terminology for understanding that, like his the story of the cave where the people are kept in this cave, and they these figures on the wall and these shadows, and they think
that's reality until they break free of their chains and see the light. And,
those shadows were actually people,
yeah.
And him, I mean, that's like the gods versus the shadows, the archetypes, though. So he really discovered that way of thinking, which is very interesting because then Eudoxus comes along, and Robert said astrology could only, he said this 20 years before he realized what time period it originated in. He said astrology could only really originate in a time period when people spoke both phasis and logos, when both were in use, which really was kind of the lifetime between Plato and Aristotle, because Aristotle just ran amok with logic, and it infected the whole Greco-Roman Empire. And Rudolf Steiner talks about this, and I was so amused. He says, yeah, with the invention of the syllogism, they learned how to lie, because you can make it sound like it's logical, but it's not. And so they learned how to lie, and then so much lying went on that just lying, it was characteristic of that time period, which reminds us that the Romans said Greek is the perfect language to lie in.
Oh man, that is actually really fascinating. As a linguist myself,
Oh
looking
yeah,
back at the different origins of language and how the evolution of language and linguistic expression ended up changing over time, and how that changes thinking, neurolinguism, I suppose we could call it, is really, really quite fascinating. And you're right. I think in your assessment, and it sounds like Robert's assessment, that maybe you're re-speaking or rehashing,
yeah,
borrowing, whatever, that
yes,
Western culture has really held so hard onto the logos, onto that logical type
yeah,
of thought. And that's actually where our modern present day empiricism from a scientific perspective and reductionism really comes from, is trying to understand that very logical, one thing leads to the next, or if this is true, then this is true, and very black and white. Yeah, and sadly, it's not even just the Western world anymore, because China has adopted the same type of thing, whether in language or in mentality.
yeah,
Um, most of the world actually, through imperialism, has been very inundated with that. So curious thing. Is interesting to see. Already we're starting to see glimpses, just like with your book, of the extracellular matrix,
yeah,
how ideas are drastically changing as a pushback to this narrative that's been shoved down our throat. And now, little breakthroughs that are showing, well, that's not right. It looks like it's right. It sounds like it's right, but it's not right.
yeah.
And it's interesting to just contemplate and think about, well, what will come next?
Yes, yes. Yeah, so I do go through this logos and phosis in my book, but I'm going to promise you guys, if I think it's already in the library for the Matthew Wood Institute of Herbalism, my paper on phosis and logos. Um, Although I may have named it, I got so irritated with these people that like cultural appropriation and colonizing, and they
Oh
use
yeah.
this of speech pattern, and it's like they don't realize that they are actually colonizing while they're speaking.
The
And,
irony just kills me. It just kills me.
yeah, and see, I did grow up on a Indian reservation, and they didn't, and so I'm familiar with these ways of speaking, and they aren't, and they don't realize that they are actually trying to make everybody agree with them. Too much Jesus, and they need to get a perspective, and it's very hard to actually, so I might have called it speech colonizing, and not because what's colonizing about it is if you say I'm right and you're wrong, then immediately you set up a war basically,
Yeah.
and you're colonized, and and then it justifies your colonization. So okay, so I do describe it some in the book, but not in as much depth as my essay. And um and so my essay, I will promise it will be in the Institute library, free. There's a bunch of free stuff in there within 2 or 3 days, probably within one day. But so the types in Genesis, so the whole of Genesis, it's completely written on word plays, and I'll give you an example. The example I use, so Eve is made from Adam's rib. Okay, this sounds like some fairy tale, children's story, anti-feminist, some thing or other.
Patriarchal.
Yes. But when you actually study the word cell, tentpole or rib, and then you begin to study all of its related terms, and you find that basically what it's related to the word for divine command or law or principle, and it's also related to, it's actually as a word for ridge or mountaintop, which is a rib of a mountain, or a shadow, the shadow, or the tent, which is a shadow if you're living in the desert.
Yeah.
And so it goes on and on with all sorts of
Hebrew
which
is so poetic that way, isn't it?
yes, yeah, multi meanings, because there's
Yeah.
only like 900 root words, and then you expand from there
Yeah.
by adding subtracting little bits and pieces at each end. But so you have Sela, law, command. You have you even have Sav, turtle, like turtle shell, mundane turtle, and so you have like kind of, so really what you're describing is more like the creation of the mundane shell of the universe, the laws of karma, the laws within which life takes place, Eve, Chava, life, with Adam, the human genome, so to speak, and the genetic aspect. So and I mean, and then you even have, kind of repercussions, because shadow, shade, things that have to do with the underworld also come, and cave, where there's a shadow, also have to do with this word. So that it's kind of like the laws of karma. All of this is implied without being stated. In fact, only that one word is used, and there's no more description of it. But this goes on and on with all sorts of word plays, just on and on. And I was shocked when I read, I wrote this book based on intuition and not divine inspiration or anything. But at one point, I was rereading the part where God was talking to Cain, and it just came to me. It was like a download revelation. It was at this moment that God felt his creation, or its creation was marred. I was like, what? Not when they
with Eve in the fall, the banishing from the garden.
No, not with the murder. It was when God had to explain and I looked at it carefully in a syllogism. If you do good, will you not be rewarded, so to speak? And it's like, oh my God, like the authoress, most likely, of the Jace part of Genesis, knows what a syllogism is, and she sure does not like it. She is the fall, with the utter fall. And then the other syllogism that's used is when his great-great-grandson Lamech says, I have killed a young man who has injured me because blah, blah, blah. He uses a syllogism too to justify himself. So we see the repercussion. So I found that fascinating. Like, here was this speech, again, these speech patterns were known to the authors. And so, but there's so many word plays in Genesis. And I think one of my, because I am such a partial to the nature wisdom tradition, I would, Melchizedek, that means Lord of right, Lord. Oh, see, well, here's and the translations too are so bad, like righteousness. Like, who wants to hear about it?
It's true. I mean, this is the biggest thing actually within the study of Kabbalah for alchemists and hermeticists too, is that every word has such a vast connotation depending on how you use it. And the traditional words like Keter, Chokma, Bina, all of the names of the Sefra are all, we should say, they have certain English translations that try and make them very numerically definitive, but it's not like that. You have to open up your mind and see that they're actually archetypes where you can see that same thing playing out in multitudinous different ways in the natural world and in the realm of ideas, and it means all of them simultaneously. It's a way of expressing a multidimensional awareness with very few words,
Yeah, that's again and again, and particularly the J authoress is a master of the few words, the least words used to get the idea across. So, like for instance, the serpent in the tree. Oh, and the tree of the experience of good and evil would be a better translation of knowledge.
Yeah.
And immediately, it's like the Christians. It's like, oh, knowledge, like good and evil, and our syllogism and right and wrong. But actually, that word da'at, which is related to one of the Sephiroth, that it is, it means experiential knowledge. It means knowledge that you experienced, which is, so I just translated the tree of the experience of good and evil. Well, that has a completely different connotation. Like, oh, you poor beings, you're going to have to live through the experience of duality now.
Yeah.
And it's not like, and the emphasis is not upon knowledge, upon knowing what good and evil is. In fact, that's more part of the problem. It is.
Yeah.
it's a karmic readout. Oh, you're going to be in a dual universe now, poor things. And but one thing was that I found, so the rabbis say the serpent in the tree must have had wings and feet and limbs, because how did it get up there? And in the Middle East, you wouldn't have a snake in a tree. And so they say, it was a dragon, basically.
Yeah.
And indeed, there's the curse on the serpent. It says, on your belly shall you crawl on the earth all the rest of your days, or whatever, and eat dirt or whatever. It's like, oh, yeah, before it wasn't crawling on its belly, so it must have had arms and wings,
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of the instances where you see the extreme use of no words, and it's almost, perhaps the text is set up for teaching people, to stretching their minds in this way, and not spelling everything out. It's not highly secretive necessarily, but it is set up that way. One thing I really liked, though, when I began to research Melchizedek, so righteousness. Okay, that word tzaddik, means a straight arrow. I mean, because ancient Hebrew, it's so literalistic, and modern Hebrew too. It's not abstract like our language. And so a straight arrow, Abraham is a tzaddik, a straight arrow, and Melchizedek, the Lord of the straight arrow, the straight way. And like righteousness means right and wrong, whereas straight arrow just means, straight arrow and crooked arrow. It's a completely different image. And so often these bad translations that they get away with, as I say, the translators. Yeah. And sometimes I'll even find them going on and on. Oh, a great one. Like they had sex before they ate from the tree, like, because the man shall leave his family and cling unto his woman, and they shall be one flesh, and they were not ashamed, and the most cunning beast in the field was the serpent. So they had sex, before the serpent showed up. So what does that mean? It means that the self-consciousness and shame and whatnot comes from this, this polarization, this duality. We're going to have right and wrong now. Oh, golly. And before that, they were free of that. And so the sex isn't bad. It's morality that's bad. If you
if you want to really dig into it.
Yeah. I pointed this out in my Hebrew class in college, and which was all the other students were all Bible college. They were good people, and one of them said, "Yeah, you're right." But Melchizedek, it turns out, is kind of the representative of natural religion that just rises up through the intuition. No ancestors, of people who just make the best of what they have in the natural world. I found this actually on a Christian website. I like the translation so much, or the suggestion, and not the chosen people and the lineage and all that, but just the knowledge of nature, and they share bread and wine, and the god of Melchizedek becomes the god of Abraham, and vice versa. And the god of Melchizedek is El Elyon, highest in a series of gods.
Yeah.
That's the supreme god of the pagans, and that word is now a word for God in Hebrew.
Yeah.
Judaism. Yeah, well, I don't want to go. Well, at any rate, there's 7 different stories that all have to do with unfolding of experiences, often to do actually with animals. When God kicks them out of Eden, take off those fig leaves, put on animal skins, and then Cain sacrificing from the vegetables from the field, and Abel from the animals, and then finally Abraham up on the mountain ready to sacrifice his son. No, there's an animal, the ram. And actually, that's, to my mind, I show this progression, that there is a time when your animal self appears before you. That's your body, like we're just this, idiotic mind occupying this animal body, which looks a lot like an animal, which any astrologer could agree with.
Absolutely.
So it's really important, and we need to actualize that and bring that to consciousness. And that occurs really in dream time is the best way to do it, or maybe a hallucinogenic plant, but at any rate, an extremely altered mind state to get there. And then when we dream of that animal, then we're on a one-to-one basis. And actually, traditionally there are those who are controlled by their animal, which is not, the animal is just, and those are controlled by the human side. And, it's not the worst thing in the world to be controlled by your animal type, but you lose out on the experience of being a human and the development of the human heart and stuff. Animals are where we get our heart from, though, and our dreaming. So the animal path, shamanism, to my mind, is the path of dream, because the warm-blooded animals have the heart and they have the dreaming. They can't control it like we do. We can, but that's all we have. We just have the rational mind, control, ego, self-consciousness. But they have relationships. They take care of their young. The reptiles don't do that, much less the amphibians. And they hunt in packs. Fortunately, the reptiles don't do that. And
yeah, very fortunately. That'd be terrifying.
Wow, you would not run into a 15 rattlesnakes hunting you down.
Oh yeah. Oh, no thanks. One is scary enough.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So the warm-blooded animals have these characteristics that we don't really attribute to them. We're superior. We have feelings, etc. They have feelings. We have that only because of them. So then the actualization of the animal self is a crucial link in the shamanic path. That's the human animal image there that personifies shamanism. And when we have that experience, then that's a highly transformative experience and something to really work on. And we do have inferences of this in alchemy, at least. Now, astrology is not really, that's not a life philosophy like this, but we have the vase with the three lions or dragons in there, red, black, and white. We have the three, and each representing perhaps a different chemical generalization. I don't know, sulfur, mercury, and salt are a different way of splitting up matter than the normal chemical way. Although it's buried in chemistry, as you know, it's actually in there. Yeah. But so those also relate, to our animal self, our human self, and then our spirit self. And the shamanic path goes through the animal to get to the spirit, because spirit would be dream time. I read, Castaneda is quite a good source on this, but he was not someone he was a trickster. His medicine animal was a coyote, and that shows up in one of the books. And Bonwan says, well, that's too bad, but there's another book by Timothy Nab, who studied with Nagualists, with shamans in central Mexico about the same time in the 70s, and called The War of the Witches. Quite really extremely dramatic, excellent book. I highly recommend it. Out of print, but not expensive. But his the terminology, that word Nagualist, that means the saucer, the animal that they turn themselves into, the spirit world. It means this. It has this sort of, by dreaming of your animal, you then open up to the spirit world, is really what that word means. That's maybe a little different in the Don Juan Carlos Castaneda. It's presented a little differently, but it's very simple, down to earth definition. And even the animal that the sorcerer turns themselves into too. So at any rate, that's the shamanic path. And I do feel it's that, how can you put it? Alchemy, I don't think that alchemy was a reflection of a shamanic teaching, but a discovery of the same principles in matter, in the soul, in the spirit, in there. We have body, soul, and spirit again too, which are the three which relate to, of course, alchemically or shamanically, like I just said. But so the principles had to be discovered. Paracelsus certainly discovered them, and he really, I think, in addition to everything else, he really was a shaman in a way. I don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know that much about his personal biography, but
I would definitely say so. Seja and I, years ago, this must have been around 2010, 2011, somewhere in there, we had conversations the first time that we met up about alchemy as a path of Western shamanism in a certain regard, because there are so many parallels. We know that, shamanism today, as it's categorized archaeologically, anthropologically, tends to be more leaning towards indigenous cultures and traditions, particularly from a more ancient or more primal past, or even a more primal existence in the present. But I think that the next evolution of that very same knowledge is taking things with the culture, because the more that you see shamanically intact cultures historically, those tend to be the more advanced cultures over time. Given enough time, they develop advanced science, advanced medicine, advanced matters of the spirit, psychological warfare, different types of things like that all become integrated into the community by way of interacting with that form of shamanism. I think that there is a very clear perennial thread across the entire globe about shamanic cultures, whether we're talking about ancient Taoist medicine and that as a practice of early shamanism, or whether we're talking about shamans of modern day Peru or of ancient Siberia, and also alchemy and modern herbalists, and even to a degree, modern science too. I mean, especially in the quantum field, as it starts to bridge over more into that realm, it's a different manifestation, but they're all coming to the same perennial conclusions.
Yeah. And yes, shamanism is in the thick of it. Yeah. This may be, I mean, people can work out, I don't know. There's work to be done there. It would be quite fascinating to work on the spiritual, there must be people for whom the alchemical ideas reflect into their soul and spirit and awaken things. So we know that it's not really well developed, perhaps, or we find other languages from other cultures, but it's innate in the alchemical worldview, and it's perhaps innate in the astrological as well. It's just that astrology, is a way of describing the archetypes, the 7 planets, the 12 signs. Well, that's really important. Even the 3, mutable, cardinal, fixed, and the 4 elements. All these things are a part of the shamanic worldview, but they're not geared towards exactly the same finishing line. It's this Platonic. Let's really describe the eidos, the eidos, the primal archetypes. Yeah,
it's absolutely true. Well, you know what? Let's go ahead and take a break. When we come back, let's go ahead and tell all of our listeners where they can find you and how they can keep in touch with all of your teachings and look forward to your future publications and things like that. So stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back.
Perhaps you've heard Phoenix speak about alchemy and spagyria, and you yourself want to start practicing? Phoenix has been engaged in more than 15 years of consistent split tests in order to find the most practical and standardized methods to create the highest quality items of spagyric pharmacopoeia possible. He provides the most detailed multimedia courses in existence, walking you through every aspect of spagyria, including beginning theory, setting up your lab, proper technique, important details on how to make a spagyric like a pro, tips for advanced practice, alchemical and hermetic applications, astrological theory, and so much more. In any of his online courses, you will be thoroughly guided through making your own items of spagyric pharmacopoeia, including spagyric tinctures, spagyric elixirs, spagyric essences, spagyric stones, and so much more. You will be able to set up your own laboratory in your home or business and craft up your very own alchemical apothecary in no time flat. To learn more about our online courses, simply visit www.phoenixaurelius.org/online courses and begin your spagyric journey today. And as an Alchemi-Culture podcast listener, You get to save 15% off the tuition of any course by entering the coupon code TEACHME15 at checkout. Again, that is coupon code TEACHME15, which will save you a whole 15% off any of Phoenix's online courses. As always, all proceeds go towards supporting this podcast and furthering our research.
Welcome back from the break, guys. We're here with Matthew Wood. And Matthew, before the break, we were actually talking about all sorts of things. We were talking mostly about your book, 7 Guideposts on the Spiritual Path, the Shamanic Story in Genesis. It's not necessarily a thin book either. Like you've actually given that quite a bit of thought.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and so it's related to my first book, 7 Herbs, Plants as Teachers. But I really for me, Genesis was a meditative document. I just kept on going back to it, learning more and more and more. And then as shamanic stories became the shamanic path became more vivid to me, I started to see more and more in that document. And I felt like I had to kind of redo it just from a totally spiritual standpoint. Yeah, the 7 Herbs book is still valid, and those 7 herbs are one way. It's a stimulating way to try and come up with 7 herbs that personify these 7 guideposts on the spiritual path. And I do believe it's a valid selection of 7 herbs. I think one could perhaps come up with some herbs that were not as obscure as like cat's ears.
Right.
And but at any rate, so there and then various people, oh, it's like 7 chakras, etc. I don't try to link together different systems so much. Or at least the ones I do link together are just really totally crazy different to some people. But Genesis and I don't know, and shamanism, that would be one.
Fair enough.
I would say you go back far enough and those documents are like 1000 BC or whatever. Everything is shamanism. It just becomes more and more shamanism. And I took as my point of departure, William Blake said, I have visited the ancient kingdoms, lordships, patriarchies, and republics of ancient times, and I've seen these, and they preserve their archetypes basically in vast, huge writings on walls hundreds of feet high, or statues, and that represented these. And then later they became the figures in Genesis and stuff, these nomadic tribes. I added this part. The nomadic tribes would go see the pictures every once in a while, and then they had a more oral tradition, and they carried this on. And as you may know, these same figures, Jacob, Esau, Isaac, they are in Sufi tales and in the Quran, and just in the folk tale and historical epics of the Middle East in general, because they represented things to many different people. So, and yeah, there definitely is a monotheistic slant that colors things from time to time. So both in the Quran and in the Torah, not to mention the Christian Bible, of course, too. So, yeah.
Well, fair enough. I'm really looking forward to digging into this. In fact, I had planned this last weekend to tear through it. I had only gotten through the introduction, which was a significant introduction, by the way. And I can't remember. I think it goes like 47 or something pages long, if I remember right. It was a long introduction.
Yeah.
It needed it, though, in my opinion, because if you just start hopping into a text like this without having any understanding or like, I guess, just context, prerequisite would be another good term, then you're going to get lost. You won't understand why you're making the correlations that you might be making. So yeah, at any rate, I'm excited to continue to get through this book. And I'm really excited for your Extra Cellular Matrix book that is coming out again. I noticed on Amazon that was shipping on November 7th. I've already placed my pre-order for that. And
yeah.
So you've got tons of things available all over the place. Yeah, holistic medicine and the extracellular matrix, the science of healing at the cellular level. So I'm very excited for that. And you mentioned earlier that you're doing a course with Judith Hill right now. You've had several courses with her over the years, though. Isn't that right? That you've offered through the Matthew Wood Institute of Herbalism?
Yeah, we did one on the planets and the herbs, and that was and there's some poor audio and things like that, so that one's very cheap. Or so we have a library, the subscription $45 a month, and you just get access to virtually everything that's in the past. An ongoing class like Judith's and mine right now is not included there, but then so that would be a class you'd sign up for, etc. And we are all we have left now is Scorpio and Sag. We started with Capricorn because we started at in Capricorn in the midwinter last year, and all the way around the zodiac. And for us serious people, I think it's appropriate to start with Capricorn.
Yes, exactly. Start with the good, hardy structure, as it were. So
Yes.
a good Saturnian sign. So with that being said, though, will that course that you're doing at present ultimately make its way into the library once the course is done?
Yeah, it will. Yeah. Yes. And there also is write-ups. The handouts with that class are phenomenal. They're really, I got to just say, phenomenal. I can't say that I have 35 pages. Oh, it's interesting. Virgo being so big, I have 35 pages on Virgo, more like 10 or 12 or 16
on the others.
Yeah. But Virgo rules all so much digestion. And teaching this she's quite rigorous. Teaching this, I understood better the Virgo and rulership of the liver, because in Western herbalism, what we call the liver is really the metabolism, which all cells have. All cells have a metabolism, a metabolic system. And so some of these most of our liver herbs affect all cells in a way. The liver taking care of 60% of the metabolism, but not all of it. So that's more how Western herbalism has looked upon the liver, and Chinese herbalism more like liver fire, like kind of anger, irritability, allergy, almost a little bit different from Western, and different from science. Whereas with the Virgo rulership of the liver, you really have the nuts and bolts. It really is the liver in a Western medical biological sense. So I began to learn and see some. It's good to also compare these systems, and they're not always congruent, but then you from the cracks between them too. So
yeah. Well, and I think that there's a certain enrichment from the perspective that you get from each of the different disciplines that you just simply can't have if you are just sticking with the perspective of a singular discipline. It helps to be more well-rounded in one's approach, especially from an herbal perspective. But the difference between just TCM, for instance, or traditional Chinese herbalism, all the way to classical Greek herbalism and on up to Western herbalism as it arrives to us today. Vast differences in approach and even pharmacology and other things like that. So very interesting. Well, that's really cool. Is there anything else that's coming up, or any other things that you'd like to let listeners know about that you're up to?
Well, we just did a great little class on iodine, on iodine, which is the evolutionary element, and that was quite interesting. We're doing me and Phyllis Light. So I teach with Phyllis Light, who's a Southern herbalist, and she's a genius, and we really work together well, and a lot of those classes are real good. So there's various, and we're going to be doing female reproductive and the endocrine system, which it's hard to get really, really, really good information on, but we both got good stuff there. We'll even be joined by a third herbalist, Lise Wolf, for the female system. And those are maybe the immediate classes. we're just about have gotten our beginning level together, and we're trying to do a beginning, intermediate, and advanced. Eventually, have a clinical side too, but it takes time to do all this. And yeah, and so Matthew Wood Institute of Herbalism, and or woodherbs.com, and Matthew Wood on Institute on Facebook. Judith has her own site. I can't remember it. Judith Hill Astrology. She has her own site now. And this Robert H. Schmidt, maybe it's different initial. I don't know. Look up Robert Schmidt Astrology. There's a really interesting work on the Greek astrology there too that I'd recommend. So
yeah, he calls it the cosmological model, right?
Yes, because at the time he died, and still I don't think Ellen's advanced it either, that you could not say for sure that it was the divinatory system. All you could say was it is for sure a cosmological model. It's like the cosmos, which they visualized as a huge animal talking to us. Yeah. So I guess it'd be one of the talking animals, not the human.
It all goes back to that, doesn't it? This prevalent animal intelligence throughout nature.
Yes, right. Well, this sounds incredible what you're doing, and I don't know, I'll have to get on some sort of mailing list or something just to stay in touch. And but you guys are so technically beyond me. As I say, I'm an alchemical philosopher, not a practitioner. So I read Franz Hartmann and that Yolande Jacobi or whatever. Those types of things are the types of things that formed my thought when I was young, and my herbalism. So my herbalism is very compatible with alchemy, but I don't go to the trouble of making spagyric products. I just stuff the herb in the bottle. Everybody has it.
Fair enough.
Or some, and some herbs like brandy better than vodka. I got that figured out kind of. Either they actually tell me they like it, or just the taste wise, it's like, well, that does not work.
Yeah, exactly. Well, all of that is really critically important too. There are, and I can say this definitively over all of my years working as both an herbalist as well as a spagyrist, is that there are different applications and different uses for herbs far beyond what the spagyric pharmacopoeia actually includes. And so for me, I like to see this type of zippering effect happening between herbalism and spagyria, where spagyria can have these certain advanced preparations for more deeply penetrating pharmacological use. But for so many of the factors, you don't need to go there. You put them in a bottle, use oil, use baser alcohols for tinctures. You homeopathically suffuse them, do your decoctions, your infusions, your syrups. All these things. They still have a very, very critical place in medicine, and one for me is not better than the other. They just have different uses. So.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I use small doses with herbs because when I was young, Frater Albertus was still alive, and when I first started as an herbalist, but there weren't really spagyric things on the market. But actually, Robert made some, Robert Bartlett, from Paralab, and we did have some. They were not really popular. People didn't understand them.
Yeah.
I can't remember what I was going to say then. But so. I didn't incorporate a lot of alchemy except for this philosophical and this, I still do think, I do think in terms of the three substances in the person and in the plant too. But I don't make my remedy that way. So,
yeah. Well, it's still using a certain perennial philosophy that we can't separate from, regardless of the way that we formulate. So I admire your work greatly. You've influenced me through all of your books over the years. I'm immensely appreciative for that, and also immensely appreciative for you coming on here. I'm very honored being a guest and sharing all of your wisdom with us today. So again, Matthew, thank you so much, man.
Okay, well, maybe we can talk another time, although we talked about so much. I'm not sure what we would talk about, but...
I'm sure we could find plenty. You and I have lots and lots of things to chat about. I'm certain about it. So yeah, we'll be in touch again soon. And for all of you listening, All of the links to the things that we've talked about will be down in the description below. If you've really enjoyed this, please go ahead and support the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy. You can do that with our Spagyrics of the Month Club or through a purchase of any of the things in the apothecary. And please go out, buy a book from Matthew, buy several of his books if you haven't. Maybe consider subscribing to his coursework as well. As $45 a month membership at the Matthew Wood Institute of Herbal Medicine. We have all of the links down below. We all appreciate your support. If you like this episode, be sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell notification if you're watching on YouTube, and get this word out for us. That's the best way that we can change the world. So again, thanks so much, everybody.